Let's say you have your Hebrew Bible in front of you, you open Exodus 20, what do you see? You see a text looking like that, lots of things inside. You can clearly see that this one has no dots. No dots.
Welcome to episode number 5 of the Bible in OBRY. I'm your host, John, and it's late October now of 2019, if you're willing to believe it. Not the late October part, that's pretty believable. The 2019 part. The late October part's very believable because I walk out my door and all the trees are turning colors. Natural colors. And that's what I'm going to be continuing with from last time. Oh, and by the way, that what I thought was the air being dry last time and my voice, that wasn't the air. My son had gotten some virus, which was less than wonderful, which got right into the sinuses and then into the lungs, the bronchioles, and it's still with me just a little bit. But anyways, what I wanted to do today is continue with the concept of examining words that are translated as the color white in the Bible. So I got to one word last time on the episode on colors. I was looking through the dozen entries on white, and I believe I started out with, I probably have it at the top of my list here, boots. That's correct. I'm going to pick it up with boots, and I'm actually going through all the entries. The reason this is coming in later than I wanted it to, because I really like to, or have tried to really hold myself to, putting this out once a week. And once I can get that rolling along with a degree of steadiness so that it's not taking up too much extra time, then I can start one of the other podcasts that I had already planned. I have a few that I've already sort of outlined with varied themes. So I definitely want to get this rolling along and steady so that I can start those others. For anybody who's been listening to me for any length of time, you know the reason that I'm trying my best to move from just a predominantly video format to one that's predominantly audio based is because first off, YouTube's just they're not a company that has shown that they have the desire to even stick with their own standards, A, and B, their agenda, they've been very clear that their agenda is to stifle types of speech. Not free speech, types of speech. Speech that they hate, which of course is all very understandable when one realizes who the people are that run Google, run YouTube, and that would be why. Unfortunately, Anchor.fm, who I upload my podcast audios to, and they distribute them out to about 5 or 6 other podcast sites. They were recently acquired by Spotify, so we're going to see how that goes too. I guess if worse comes to worse and there was no other podcast site to post to without paying them, which at this point in time I could see if you had no kind of following to per se, I could see them wanting some kind of a membership fee for unlimited uploads, that sort of thing. That's not where I'm at. I've waited years to even start doing something like that and putting it out there. So we'll see if another place is available. If not, the next plan was actually starting a page on archive.org and just including links to it on my site. Now, some people are doing that who have been just absolutely ejected from YouTube and don't want to have anything to do with them either, which I totally understand. They'll do the same thing with links to BitChute, but BitChute's a bit clunky in its blockchain format, oftentimes taking a long time to load, if ever. So that's the story, what's going on. But without any further ado, I'm going to get right to these colors. And this last week and a half, what I did, I devised a form, a way to show the study of each one of these words, similar words that would have similar roots out of all of the words available in OBRY and the so-called Old Testament. Also doing searches on the online etymology dictionary to find what modern words, whether they be English, Germanic, Proto-Indo-European, and so forth, would likely have their roots in OBRY. And these, as I go, I will be able to post on the website, on the references. Is it references? Resources page. And so that anybody that doing any word studies that, you think any of this would be helpful, and it will be, believe me, because you're not going to find this sort of word study, certainly not with this kind of understanding or approach to the language. So they'll be very good resources. I'll post them there as soon as I can after I make each one of these shows or episodes. So as I said last time, I did go through boots a bit. I'm going to go through it here once again because I've put it through a more grueling set of filters and come up with something a bit different than last time. Now, the word boots is one that is translated at some point in the Old Testament, because when you punch in a search for an English word in Blue Letter Bible, it's going to show you all of the occurrences wherein that word would be translated as that, or all the words translated as that word. Funny thing is, something you will find when you start doing word studies in the Bible, whether it be in Hebrew or Greek, so-called, as in OBRY or Ellen, that unfortunately you're going to find very little consistency. And a word that you might be looking for words that mean or are translated white, because you in fact want to find words that mean white. You'll find right away when you start looking through the different ways it's translated, which they'll give you right near the top of the entry in Blue Letter Bible. They'll give you that as well in the KJC tab in eSword. All the different ways a word is translated. And some ways aren't that big a deal because there's little variation. If something is translated as white a time or two, and then maybe white linen or linen, then you could kind of see, oh, okay, I kind of understand why they would do that. But you're going to see more variations in words than you ever thought there should ever be in one single word. In fact, if dictionary companies today in modern English, if they were giving this wide a variety of definitions of English words, people would very quickly stop taking them seriously. And this same thing happened before the powers that be actually standardized the Masoretic text. Before they standardized it in what we know of today as the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and many people will just say the Masoretic text. Though, as I've said, there are some variations. You have to be careful what Masoretic text you're looking at. Some have less verses than your typical King James-based Bible translation. Some more. But in general, before that happened, there were a lot of people really losing faith in Masoretic text because, first off, the wide variance of, I guess we'll call it punctuation. It's the dots and dashes and so forth that they use. They're nikudot. There was so much variation between Masoretic texts that had been produced that a serious student of Hebrew would get fed up and fast. In fact, there was nothing but a great deal of argument and disagreement even amongst the Jews, the rabbis, that used various Masoretic texts. So I ask you, if it was standardized based on the keeping of time-honored tradition, why is it that they had such a great deal of variance within their text until they boiled it down to an agreed upon standard text in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which based on the Leningrad Codex? It's relatively recent that they've offered up this standardized text within a few centuries or so. The story goes the Masoretes did this standardization of the text between the 7th and 10th century AD, if you're willing to believe it. A lot of strange things happened between the 7th and 10th century AD, like Khazaria. A lot of very interesting things in the land of Khazaria. But how much of those stories are just make-believe, like many other supposed historical stories? I don't know. So, our first entry that we're going to look at is, as I said, boots. H948. It appears 8 times. It's translated typically as fine linen and white linen. Its likely related modern words would be, for instance, bus from omnibus, or the German Bus as in kiss, or French kiss as in Beiser, or Beiser, whichever way they pronounce it. Now, the idea here, as we're going to see in my explanation for why boots fails to meet the requirements of our modern equivalent of the color white, you'll start understanding why modern words like bus, and from the Latin omnibus, the German Bus and the French Beiser, why those are likely modern related words. Now, the related OBRY words are H949, butsats, with the extra tsa at the end. Now, this was a rocky path named by Jonathan in 1 Samuel 14:4. He had named these two sharp rock outcroppings and paths you could go by in these interesting sort of names. The thing is, the way that 1 Samuel 14:4 is translated is not very fair concerning what he's naming or why. Okay, so that this was a name that he gave. The double tsa at the end is very telling, and you'll see why as I go into my explanations for passes and fails. Okay, another one that seems related is H1000. It's translated as egg. H1214 is butso. It's translated as covetous, greedy. Also related is H1215, butso, acquisition. Same thing. H1219 is butsar, which is translated gather, fence, or enclose. Also related is H1223, batsure, H1225, batsarun, and H4013, mabutser. All of these typically have to do with, if you see in the Bible, words like fenced cities, walled cities, fortified cities, things like that. You're typically going to be looking at something with a root of butser and mabutser. Okay? Another related word, H6899, kibbutz. And a lot of you who pay attention to what the Jews are up to in Palestine would know or have heard this root kibbutz. Kibbutz. They called their early communist colonies that were doing all kinds of very secretive things and activities, guising in the guise of agricultural communes, though those kibbutzes and members of those kibbutzes have not only gone on to be very influential people in American and worldwide societies, those kibbutzes were oftentimes used in a number of secretive operations where the people that were doing the work in these operations had to be pass probably very rigorous security tests. Oftentimes, the people of a kibbutz would be used by whomever would be conducting archaeological digs in certain places. So you really needed people that were tight-lipped and could all repeat the same story. But, all right, that aside, the word kibbutz is translated gathering or assembly, and also related words would be H6908, kibbutz without the U, and H6910, kibbutza with that feminine ending. H7258, rubutz, and it's typically translated as this, a couching place. Usually in the context of, well, either a person as like in a solitary, comfortable place to lie down, or even a creature or an animal. It's used in that way. It only appears about 4 or 5 times. So here is why it fails to meet our modern requirement of white. It failed due to its most probable meaning, in the sense that the letter tsa, called tzadi in Hebrew, having the connotation of growing or moving, plus the b, in, with, by. Those glyphs that are used for really common prefixes and suffixes really help us a lot in understanding what they should mean in their pictographical or ideographic sense. So those two things, they make it a great candidate for, let's say, linen. If it were in fact this word boots, if it in fact did mean linen or fine linen, it doesn't necessarily make it white, as linen isn't naturally white. It has to be bleached to become white. Linen can be anything from ecru, being yellow, pink, brown, to a darkish gray. Linen does grow inside the stalk, though. It is, it's basically like the inner bark of the stalk, which makes the word boots a very good candidate for linen, but it absolutely does not make it a good candidate for the color white, as we understand it today. The next entry is the word dar. That is simply just de and er, dar. It is H 1858. Now, it appears one time in Esther 1:6. Now, the thing about Esther, I don't want to say I entirely ignore Esther. In fact, I pay a lot of attention to Esther, especially when I'm writing the book that I'm currently writing on the geography of the Bible versus the ancient Near East. Because Esther has some statements making certain geographical and historical claims that, in my opinion, really work against the ancient Near East. The thing is, I don't pay attention to Esther in the sense of valid scripture. We have nothing else, for one thing, within the Bible letting us know that in any way those things happened or that those characters existed. So the thing is, there isn't any good internal evidence from either the early Testament or the latter Testament. It's not there. The other thing is, it's just not there. There is not the naming of Yahweh or even Aliim or any credit, praise, thanks given to him in any way, shape, or form in this book. As far as I'm concerned, when I read that book, it appears more like the mindset of and a story of, a tale of modern day Jews, which I do not view in any way, shape, or form as those who would be Judah in the early Testament, or Judah, almost exactly the same word. It's definitely a transliterated form of it in the Ellen or Greek in the latter Testament. I don't see them as the same people whatsoever. But that's what it strikes me as, is a story of today's Jew, not the Judah of the early Testament or the latter Testament. Okay? So I don't tend to give it a lot of credit when it comes to accuracy. There are expressions and wordings in the book of Esther that make me think that it was possibly originally written in Aramaic, or somebody with the Aramaic mindset. So as I said, one appearance, Esther 1:6. However, throughout the early Testament, there are a number of related words. Now, possible modern related words would be duress, a Proto-Indo-European deru, meaning hard, duration, and durable. So the related words in the Bible would be H 1752, dur, with the middle u. So it is a three-glyph word, and it's translated as dwell. Also related would be H 1754, dur, 1755, dur, both spelled the same way. The 1755 dur is most typically translated as generation, as opposed to dwell. H 4071, mdure, pile of wood, conical and tall. That's what that word would be describing. Now another would be H 1861, derabun, translated as a goad or a thing sharp and erect. This could either be a stick or a thorn, whether it be long or short, hard thorn. Also 1863, H 1863, dardar, translated as thistle. H 5087, nadar, translated as to vow, but also related as H 5088, nadar, a vow. H 7713, shadare, which is translated as a row or plank, typically having to do with wood, something made of wood, or something wooden. Now, I put this as a fail for white, due to it having a more probable meaning within the dur family, as we see in the OBRY portions of Scripture. It is odd, but not entirely surprising, that dur, with that middle u, so de, u, can be generation, translated as generation. Madure as pile of wood, and dur, roots in English and Proto-Indo-European, meaning something stable. You remember the Proto-Indo-European word deru meant hard, and we see that in things like durable, duration, as something hard, something stable. Now, something that's kind of interesting here, right? Now, words such as H4924, matheh, and H7626, Shebath, both appear as tribe and rod, or scepter and staff. Sometimes would be tribe or people, sometimes rod, staff, or scepter. So it's not a strange thing to see dur as generation, and that's probably the most frequent translation of dur you'll find, is as generation. But also to see dur and dar words translated as, for instance, madura, pile of wood, dardar, thistle, darun, goad. Because we also see that relationship of a group of people, specifically a group of Israelites, but generation is used for more than just Israelites. But we do see that the correlation between a tribe or a specific group of people, and in the sense of dur generation, that is a specific group of people within a specific time, and something having to do with a staff, a scepter, a piece of wood. Now, I don't have all the answers to why, I don't have really any of the answers as to why those correlations exist, but they do exist. And we see them in a few different examples, as I just mentioned. Dar is used enough, or variations of dar is used enough as a structural member, and it just having the one appearance, and that appearance being in Esther 1:6 with other, and the thing is, within Esther 1:6, it actually has other obscure words around it. Immediately succeeding it is a variation of Sehar, which they actually try to turn into Shihar, which is often translated as dark. If you look at the whole passage, and you would go through word by word and do, you would do the, let's say in Esor, the right click with the see all occurrences in the Old Testament. For each one of those words that appears in that verse in Esther, you would find that a handful of them are translated a bit or very differently in that verse in Esther than at other places in the Bible. So because the word that it is modifying or being modified by, following it, is obscure and poorly translated anyways, it makes it even harder to determine that this would be white. And again, with all those other related words in the Old Testament, meaning things like something hard, stable, as in wood or thorn or thistle, and sometimes with the idea of standing erect in the air of the word. Now, this glyph air, the counterpart to our modern day R, has been pretty difficult for me. I don't entirely understand exactly the best reason for its usage in the front of a biglyph or triglyph, but most specifically the bi. As I said, all triglyphs that I have studied so far, they all get broken down into a biglyph, either at the front or the back of the word. So I'm not 100% positive what the air is doing either at the front or the back of the word. However, when you take a look at many words, many biglyphs or triglyphs that have the air at the end, a lot of times they're going to have a sense of standing erect. They could have a sense of being tall, or like as endure, a sense of hardness and stability. Now, if the air or R, if that really is as say the Ancient Hebrew Research Center and others that share their mind concerning what these glyphs are supposed to mean, if they were right about the fact that the air or R, or in their case they would call it the resh or rush, which is what the Jews call it, the Masoretes probably most likely are the ones who named these what they're called today. If they're right about that, and it is a picture of a man's head, if it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that it ends there. And we have to think man every time we see it. That could really trip us up. If it does because it is alluding to something else. As I probably mentioned last time, the book by Wall comparing hieroglyphics and other old languages by various peoples and tribes around the world that either had been translated by somebody interacting with that tribe or people type enough to where they understood the language, and they then explained why they used certain ideographs to mean certain things. There is a bit of insight that he's able to share, and he uses it to compare translations or ideas that have been proposed about hieroglyphic and biblical Hebrew. Now, I'm not to that part with him so far, because this work is not only quite verbose, but it's also very in-depth. It's just something you have to go back and keep rereading as you go. But he does mention the sense that a particular bird in hieroglyphic, when you see it, you're not supposed to think of bird per se, but it would be representative of the human soul, perhaps in the sense of the flying high, or the freedom, or something about it. So just because a glyph may represent something concrete, like, say, a man or a man's head, and I'm not 100% right now saying that the air does, but if it does, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to think, when we see it, man, but instead we may need to be thinking of what are the qualities of that image. It's very likely that these glyphs, like many of these words, have both a concrete application and one or more abstract applications. Now, I avoid, as much as I can, working with these. I try to avoid the slippery slope of just applying whatever meaning or connotation, or especially denotation, that I need that glyph to have in order to prove a point. I don't have points that I'm trying to prove. I'm trying to understand this language. So there are probably going to be mistakes and errors I make in getting to know specifically what these glyphs mean in a concrete and abstract way as I go. And this is why I would hope more people would start looking at it in this way, looking at this language as something that is ideographic as opposed to phonetic, and start figuring this out. Because here's the reason. And I've stated this before, but I can't drive this point home strong enough or hard enough. These glyphs have to either have an inherent value and meaning, so that somebody who's clever can't just come along and play around with them enough to derive whatever they want from them. They either have to have a concrete inherent value to them, so that even if one rather clever sophist comes along and fools a lot with them and their meanings, that many other people down the line can say that was incorrect. That person was either confused, wrong, or lying, and show how these things concretely mean something. Because if we can't figure out this language in a very objective, concrete way, then, as I said, we're just back at being at the mercy of the Masoretes and the Sophists and whomever is just going to dictate by fiat that this language is phonetic, or whatever they want to say that this language is. So considering the properties of the de and the er together, and the fact that all these other roots are used for things that may be hard or erect, pointed, like thistles, thorns, and such, and with the obscure words around it in that passage in Esther, I could conclude, if anything, that the dar mentioned in that passage could be a staff, post, structural member, or an obelisk, etc. But either way, it fails to meet the requirements of our modern understanding of the word or color white. Now, after these, we have two large families of words and one more individual entry. I'm going to hit that individual entry first. It is H7388, rear. That is spelled er, ich, er, rear. Now, it only appears 2 times. It's translated as white and spittle, one of each, though it's defined that when you do, for instance, the Blue Letter Bible Concordance entries, okay? When you get your definitions, and unfortunately, let me see how I can best explain the way these definitions are done. What you're typically going to see at the at the top of an entry, whether it be at Blue Letter Bible or you're at Bible Study Tools, Bible Hub, or eSword, it really doesn't matter. If you're looking at any type of concordant or lexicon entries, what you'll probably get is you might get start-off definitions, which are going to be from one of only a few sources. And they're going to be basically an agreement that some particular scholars have come up with concerning what these words specifically meant. Now, they may be directly from rabbinical sources, or what's become extremely common is that they're going to give you a definition of what this most likely is or means based on something called the twat reference. And now, if it were me, I think I would have named this anything other than the Theological World Book of the Old Testament. Twat. I would come up with just about anything. Anything. However, its authors didn't. Its authors are Gleason Archer and R. Laird Harris. Now, I'm not going to comment too much on Archer because I have heard that on certain people that we're all familiar with, but Harris far more than Archer. However, for anybody who's ever seen much of the John Ankerberg show, he loves to pull out Gleason Archer as his weapon of scholarliness, as I like to put it. So anyways, Archer and Harris are responsible for the twat, so you can thank them. Anyways, that's oftentimes what you'll get is a definition of it as according to what's considered a very authoritative work like the twat. The thing is, whether it's the Theological World Book of the Old Testament or any other source, lexiconic source that the words are being derived from, the one thing you're going to find is that most of these references just tend to kind of gravitate towards the same definitions. Anyways, you'll usually see a discrepancy between whatever it is they're saying that the Bible usage is and what the actual occurrences of the words are. That's usually the first sort of conflict that you'll find to be the case. But anyways, in the case of Ruhr, as I said, it's translated as once white and once as spittle. But it is defined in one of those accepted standard reference works as slime or juice. The possible modern related words would be, for instance, Spanish rio, river, or Proto-Indo-European re, as in R-E-I, to flow or run. Its related words in the Bible would be H1865, de Ruhr, being de er, meaning liberty, or defined, though, as flowing. H7325, Ruhr, to flow, and that appears only once as Ruhr, only air, without that middle oo. However, this is my favorite one. It is, how does this work? It is listed as Ruhr, appears in the concordance as Ruhr, but appears in the text as rar, without the middle affixed singer or vowel. H7301, Ruhr, being filled with liquid. The with liquid part is kind of the connotation to it, but it definitely checks out contextually as being filled. Also related to that word is H7302, Ruhr, watered. H7377, re, moisture or watered. And H7324, ruk, that's R-U-K, or ku, sorry. K is the sound it makes, ku, to draw out, empty, pour forth. It appears only as ruck without that middle oo, and reek with a middle e instead of the oo. Now, the thing that is just insane is that kind of thing happens all the time. Also related to that word is H7385, reek, empty, vain. When I give you the definitions immediately following these words, this is just how it's defined in a concordance. This is not my definition. If it's really poor, though, I'm typically going to tell you that either I think so or that it's unproven. But again, that reek, it's translated as empty or vain in the sense of poured out. Also, H7326, rush, R-U-Sha, poor, lacking. And it's most likely from the ru plus sha, equaling poured into the ground. Now, that's my take on the definition. That's something you'll see in the document if you were to look at the document instead of hearing me going through this. Also related is H7389, rish. Now, this word failed due to the high likelihood that re/ru, that root, it means something akin to pour, with a definite connotation of a liquid, and perhaps specifically the liquid of the body. Thus, reek and rook can mean one who is thin, not just poured out, but that would be the idea. The problem is not all liquids and not all bodily liquids and not all fluids or things that flow are white. So it definitely can't be viewed as white. The one occurrence is describing King David drooling into his beard, and the word for the drool or the spittle is this word. And then the other usage of it is in the book of Job, which the passages in the book of Job being that they're often so poetic, and you'll find this in poetic passages and apocalyptic passages, is a real serious inconsistency to the usage of words. But anyways, it's a question he's asking. He says, is there any white, or is there any taste in the white of an egg? And he's using the term rear. The problem is the word that's used and translated as egg only has one occurrence, and other roots available are inconclusive as to whether or not that's even egg. So as far as I'm concerned, this word absolutely does not pass the white test. Now, the next couple of things that we're going to look at, they're just two families, and they'll basically represent what's left. Well, I'm sorry, three families. But they're going to represent pretty much everything that's left. I told you there was about a dozen entries of words that are translated as white. And we're going to see this pretty often, is that typically, and even somebody who doesn't know OBRY or Hebrew can look at these words oftentimes when they maybe punch in an English word and they want to see all the words that are translated as that. They'll oftentimes see a familial relationship in the form of these words when you get this list of words. The next entry we're going to deal with is one that is called Hor. It is H2353. Now, this entry itself, spelled Ha-U-Er, appears only 2 times. However, I have included in this particular listing and word study the other entries that you would see if you were to punch in white to a word search, say in Blue Letter Bible. So the other things that are going to show up is like the Aramaic H2353, Hur, spelled the same way. Also the OBRY H2751, Hari, which is Ha-Er-E. And nope, those are the only other entries. So I've included them as related words right away in the word study for this. It just basically saves time and paper space, so I don't have to keep giving my conclusive remarks to each and every single one of these listings, since it's really obvious that those other words are related to this word. So it is translated as white, again, though it's defined as white stuff or white linen. Now, it's possible related modern words would be hurry, or the Middle English huren, meaning vibrate or buzz, the Proto-Germanic hurza, to move with haste, harass, harry, Harry, meaning to make war, or Old German / Old Norse / Old Dutch, make war. Or perhaps the German, which has gone kind of over into a number of languages, Herr. Either the way it's used in German as Herr, or the way that it might be used or thought of in Western societies, American and English, meaning someone who would inherit, could also be related to this family of words. And Hor is one that does have some open questions that within this type of word study, I was not able to entirely determine. What I'm intent on determining in this is whether or not it's fair or accurate to deem these words as an equivalent of our concept of the color white. The related words, we'll start out with the 2358, Hor, which is the Aramaic entry as white. It appears only once in Daniel 7:9 as a modifier with the word snow. In Aramaic, snow is talag. In OBRY, it's shalag. Aramaic's kind of odd in that way that there just are certain glyphs that are just slightly different. Every time you would see a sha in OBRY, typically it's going to be a ta in Aramaic, or the so-called tav. This is done with probably not quite a half dozen of the glyphs, though. I mean, between what they consider Hebrew and Aramaic today, they would probably just call them letters. But that's the biggest difference. Funny thing with Arami or Aramaic, you would expect it to be a lot different than OBRY or Hebrew. A lot different. It's so similar in so many ways that I can often, looking at a passage that is written in Arami instead of OBRY, pick out what words are OBRY words, just because there's that small set of glyphs that are literally just swapped out as equivalents, like I just mentioned, from the sha to the ta. Now, the reason I think that's so weird is because, all right, for one thing, it's not the strongest thing, but there's that time that's recorded in both Isaiah and 2 Kings, I believe, and Chronicles, where this guy Sanballat is come to represent the current king of Ashur, or Assyria, who at that time, I believe, was Sennacherib. And he's speaking to these representatives that come out to him from inside Jerusalem. He's speaking to them in OBRY, and they ask him to switch his language to Arami so that the men standing nearby, keeping guard on the wall, wouldn't understand what he's saying. Well, with how similar that is, I just don't know. And with how much contact that both the nation of Judah and the nation of Israel had with Aram, a lot, because it bordered them. Why it wouldn't just be such a simple second language for most of them to have. That, for me, it's just kind of a head scratcher. If what they tell us today, presenting as Aramaic, was the language that the Arami, those of Aram, spoke, it wasn't that much different. And there are passages that talk about, for instance, their conquerors that would come from the north, Babel, which I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but where they tell us Babylon is directly to the east of where Palestine is, by the way. Anyways, they would say that it was a very strange language they would speak, very foreign to them. However, when we see the interactions with them, specifically in the book of Daniel, we see it in Aramaic, Arami. We don't even see any other language of the Kasdim, not Chaldeans, but the Kasdim. We don't even see another language mentioned other than that. So again, that strikes me as Pretty odd. Okay, so the thing, though, with that passage, the Aramee passage, and the word translated as white, and how it seems to appear with snow or be a modifier as snow. And as I said in the last episode, one thing we typically want to look for is those comparisons. Words that would begin with the k, because that's typically going to mean like or as. It's going to be prefixing a simile. We want to look for those because it's going to help us. If we can clearly see that snow, the word shalag, or in the case of Aramee, talag, is in fact snow, then it's going to help us a lot to figure out whether or not that word is our modern equivalent of white. There's a little bit of a problem in not only this passage, but some of the passages in OBRY that purport to have the said word being compared with snow to give it the sense of being white. So the problem I have in Daniel 7:9 is syntax. And this is the same problem I'm going to have with some of these other words that are translated as white. When they appear in passages wherein there is supposed to be that comparison specifically to snow, the problem is syntax. Because I can bring up snow in either OBRY or Aramee, and in the case of Aramee, I get really only one entry of this talag, which is supposed to be the OBRY equivalent of shalag, snow. But I can bring up snow, and I can look at it in context and see that contextually, when you're going to see something that is compared with snow, thus having the prefix of ka, meaning like or as. In the other passages, the syntax is very clear what it's referring to, and thus making that word white. And even within the syntax of this Aramee passage, it does not prove that this entry, this Hor 2358, is meaning white. It is a passage describing the Ancient of Days. Okay, so in King James English, it would say, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as a burning fire. Okay, if you look at it in the Aramee, though, what you're going to see is, after it says that the Ancient of Days was seated, the yatab, it'll have the word labushe, meaning garments. Immediately following labushe, you'll have the katalag, as snow. Then, following that, you'll have the Hor. And then after that, it'll have shor, which is his hair, which is interesting because in this instance, it is spelled the same as an OBRY. There's not really a consistency to these things. Anyways, the hair of his head, rashe, and then they'll give those similes. They'll say ka-omer, which is the Aramee word used for wool. The thing is, right after that ka-omer, the like wool, you have this word naka, pure. Okay? It's going to work really similarly when you back up and go to this area where white is. Katalag, snow. All right? His garments, labushe. Katalag, as snow, Hor. Now, when you see the overwhelming majority of how Hor and Har are used, you'll see that what is more likely being said here than her being white is glowing, like snow, shining, glowing, or dazzling. Okay? So I'm going to go back here to this. The first entry, Hur in the Arami, I just gave that to you. The next, and this is also listed as words translated as white, as I told you, that's the ha, er, and e spelled, hari. The way it's defined as white and white cake, though it only has, again, it has one appearance in Genesis 40:16. It is where this baker is telling Yusuf or Joseph about his dream. And he says he has these baskets on his head. And then this word hari is used. There's no contextual affirmation of white or white cake. But based on the rest of what we're going to see with Har and Hur and Hari, those types of roots, probably more like steaming or warm. Now, other related words are H2750, Hari translated as heat or even burning. And it always appears with H639 up, which it's used for anger or nostrils. So like a hot anger or steaming anger. Also in that line would be H2734, hare, kindle, wrath, or hot. You'll see that in passages like, and Yahweh's anger was kindled, or somebody was kindled, meaning that they were angry. Everybody has heard just in common language of today, somebody steaming when they're described as being angry. Now, there's also H2740, Harun, again, translated as anger, fierce, wrath. Now, another associated word, H2355, Hur, spelled the same as the word we're looking at. It's defined as networks and is used as white. Again, only one appearance in Isaiah 19:9, totally unproven. Likely furious or fervently. It's describing weavers. However, in the description, it could quite likely mean desperate. Doing something desperately or fervently. Like I said with the modern English-related words, huren, hurry, things like that. The next is H2356, Hur. Now this is the really strange one. I mean, even more strange than a couple of ones up. We're going to see another one it's a bit odd, but this one's really strange. It is the same spelling, which is ha, u, er, and it is used as whole. It's used a number of times as whole. Exactly the same word. Now, I know I told you in at least one or two episodes back, I've got a bit of a philosophical problem with homonyms in OBRY. And the reason for this is the same reason why, say, this author, Wall, who wrote this book that I was just talking about, the same reason why he has a problem with languages that incorporate one or more diaphones in that language. So again, a diaphone is a letter like C, because C can be rendered as an S sound or a K sound. The problem with modern English and Germanic languages, and not to mention a number of other languages, is the amount of diaphonic words, because that leads to confusion, not clarity. That would be the problem I have with homonyms in OBRY. Homonyms cause more confusion than clarity. So, Hor, this entry of Hor that is translated as whole, and it's just about a dozen times. The problem with that is that it requires an extensive word study to find out if that's even appropriate, which means that all the words around it in every single one of those passages would also have to be weighed and considered as to their accuracy before one could consider if every single one of those occurrences of Hor is accurately translated as whole or not. So we only have a few more related left. H2357, Hor, spelled the same way, and it's translated as to become pale. It only has one appearance in Isaiah 29:22, and not enough contextual evidence to conclude white or pale, and based on all of the other related words, I would say angry is just as good a descriptive word to use there as pale, actually a far better descriptive word to use there. So the next word is one of those oddities, but it's not quite as odd as whole was. Now this one is just har, so it's a ha and an er. And it is used most frequently, translated as noble or freeborn man. And it might seem a little strange to figure out how that factors into what the rest of the witnesses seem to be pointing at, except if you were to do a search on even noble in the online etymology dictionary. It's interesting the definition that they give. For instance, they'll define it as well-known, famous, renowned, excellent, superior, splendid, high-born, of superior birth, and also illustrious, distinguished, of high rank or birth. Now, if you punch a few of those words into a decent dictionary, and you check the synonyms, for instance, for illustrious, splendid, so on and so forth. There's actually a lot more to this particular definition I don't feel like reading, so it would take too long. You'll find that what we've seen so far in a lot of these words, where we are actually seeing words that are more properly things such as glow, or having to do with a certain type of radiance or heat, then it doesn't become so odd at that point. The next is H2775 harass. So that's ha, er, and s, and it's used specifically as the heat from the sun. And H2787 harar, so a double air there after the ha, burned, kindled, angry, and it's also related to H2788 hararim, which is used, I believe, once, and it's translated as dry places, and I'm not sure about how absolutely accurate that is. Now, this entry, again, it failed for the modern equivalent of white, because there really was no contextual proof of the color white. The combination of that ha, which I've found is used most often for repetition, like breathing or rope or chain, and the air at the end, which, as I said earlier, is possibly connotating or denotating erect, upright, as in man, would account for a definition akin both to arid and the shimmering of heat. This doesn't currently account for, again, the whole entries, but those entries do require a good deal of examination not within the scope of this study. Again, just trying to determine whether or not these words are a pass or fail for white. Now, from this point forward, I've taken you through the basic methodology I'm using and have been careful to be particular about carefully going through these word studies that I've made. From here on out, it's going to be a little more brisk as I go through this, because it will be posted on the site not long after this episode is posted to the various channels where it's posted, and you'll be able to look at it. So that will give me a little more time to talk about I guess the solution when we're finished, because there will be some questions I think that need to be addressed for sure. The next group is it's interesting because it's kind of a blend between two, and it's why I'm moving directly to this one. Now, I started out with the biglyph tsa, so that is just spelled with the tsa and the ha, or tsa. This also includes three other listings. Two of those actually have a har root at the end. So it's going to be interesting whether it's in this family or the family of words that I was just in. By the time we're done, it will matter in the sense of if you're trying to exactly determine what any of those two triglyph words exactly mean, then yeah, it's important. But for the purposes of what we're doing right now, maybe not so much. So we begin with H6703 tsa, and it appears 4 times as dazzling, glowing, or bright, and it's used once as white. Now, the possible related modern words are shine, shimmer, zeal, glisten, or you have, for instance, the word gal tsa, which is the combination of roll and glow. Gal tsa, glisten. Phonetically, just about every word that I'm going to include in the potential modern related words are going to be very similar, as well as their usage. So the first few entries are, of course, entries that you'll see when you do a study, or a search on the word white. The first one, H6705, is tsaha. It's defined as to glow, and it's translated as white. Also, H6713, tsahar. Now, this is the one that is it possibly the tsa root to this triglyph, or is it the har root, the har family that we were just in? Interestingly, this one's definition is reddish gray or tawny, which is not white, but it's translated as white. And again, H6715 tsahar, same spelling as the last one. It is defined as tawny, and it is translated as white. Tawny is basically an older spelling or usage of a more modern tan, or even a light tan. But definitely tan, definitely not white. So that's a bit of a problem right there. There are more similar roots. There is Tsae, H6704, defined as parch, but not proven. Now there's H6706, Tsahia, and it's defined as shining or glaring surface, but it's translated mostly as top or top of a rock or thing, which I'm not sure I entirely understand. There's Tsahai, shining or glaring surface, which once again, it is translated once as higher places, but it's pertaining to the top of a rock. There's Tsatsaut, and it's defined as scorched region. They always love to roll out scorched region because then it sounds more like the Negev desert. And it's used as dry places. Unproven. And then there's Tzahak, laughter, like the son of Abram, and Sheri, Yitzhak, Yitzhak. Also, the other relation would be another Tzahak, because they like to parse out the so-called nouns and verbs into different entries. This family failed due to the obvious usage in relationship to similar words being appropriately used as glow, dazzle, sparkle, etc. The glyphs tsa plus ha as the root of this family speak for themselves. Tsa, to grow or move, and the ha, repetitive, like breathing or rope. And now it's true that H67, 13, and 15, which are the Tsahar words, they might also fall into the earlier Dar or Dur family, but their current translations are unproven and thus could potentially fall either way upon closer inspection. But either way that they fall, they're both, I wouldn't even call them unproven. They're both clearly not equivalents of our modern word white. So the last family then that we come to is the words, and this is the one that made this episode end up coming in so late. This one took such a large amount of time to look at not only all of the variations of it, but the possible biglyphs, because the two words that I'm going to be going over now, they're triglyph words. So they could potentially be made up of a biglyph in the front or in the back. And they are the ones that are most known by anybody who's done any word studies, especially those in CI or white nationalism. These would be the most commonly used words when they point out white, though not all the time. What you'll find out if you do go through all of these words that I've gone over so far and look at the entries in which they are translated as white, you'll see that many of those entries have been, in my opinion, erroneously used by people to prove that the Israelites were white. And as I said in my previous episode, if you should look in the mirror and you see someone who's white, you should get to the hospital. We are not white. If anything, and I think this is a good example, is I knew at least one foreigner of another race who told me that in their country, the word they have for white people, Caucasians, the word is actually translated mechanically from their language as red face, not white face. And we'll get to red in later episodes, and you'll see how that's probably a lot more appropriate than pointing to these words such as white, especially when you see the passages used, because this word that we're about to look at, it's not one of the words that's most usually used by those trying to prove that Israelites are quote-unquote white. I don't know anybody other than albinos that are white, and even they are pretty much mostly pinkish. So the words I'm talking about are Laban. There's 2 entries from Strong's translated as white of Laban. It's H3835 and H3836. 3836 is going to fall under my entry for this word study, but I'll go over both of them in a bit of depth when I explain what my conclusion was for this. The first entry of Laban, 3835, appears 8 times. It is translated as white, make brick, and other things concerning brick and making. The possible related modern words would be ones such as labor, lupus, from extensive Levitical skin disease descriptions, or Greek laparoscopy. The lapar being the soft middle of a person. The lapar and laparoscopic referring to the middle stomach region. Also perhaps leper, because there is a word, it's not Laban, it's another word that's translated often as leper and leprosy, but it happens to be in most of those passages where we see the other entry of Laban at. And lavender, or labiate family, which is what lavender is in, and you'll see why I chose to include lavender in that. The related words, first is the other entry of Laban, H3836. Now, it is predominantly translated as white, and you'll mostly see this word used in passages in Leviticus. And it's concerning the description of a certain type of communicable skin disease, which, as I said, seems to always be translated as leprosy. And I hope I'm going to be able to speak on that at least a little bit before I'm done with this entry. The other related words are, for instance, H3820, leb. And that is just L and be, leb. It's translated pretty appropriately, it would seem, as inward, mind, heart, or from within. Also related words are H3822, labab, so the double be at the end, and another labab, and lebe, and lebe. All of these words are translated, in my opinion, pretty appropriately, with the meaning or usage of heart or inner self or within or insides. In fact, labab, I think, is most appropriately heart, whereas lebe doesn't necessarily have to be heart, could be emotions or mind. Those things aren't necessarily separated in the wording. It would take those who are translating these things or parsing them out to separate. So what I mean by that is the idea of the heart being emotional, like we think of the heart being the seat of emotion and the mind being the seat of logic. Those things aren't necessarily parsed out in the OBRY text or thought. Okay, so another related entry is H3828, labune, with that u between the be and n. It's translated exclusively as frankincense. Now, it's called this due to the presumption of white. Frankincense can be, although it is not always, can be a white-looking crystal sort of stone. Can be. In fact, a lot of frankincense produced is not white at all. It can be more creamy, yellow, or other colors. This is a lot like the issue that we saw with linen. Something that I'm going to talk a little bit about is it could be that the reason this word is used for something that is burned as an incense. And this was something that would be burned in the tent of meeting as an incense. It could well be a compound via excretion or weeping or oozing, a compound of something, plant, tree, whatever, of weeping or oozing. Laban oftentimes having at least a heavy connotation towards inner stuff, or Laban. And we should see why as I continue. Now, another entry related, H3839, Lebanah. It's usually the first three glyphs are pronounced a little bit closer together so that the emphasis can be put on that final Lebanah. It's translated typically as white poplar, though it's unproven. But it is, in my opinion, more than likely a white wood. This first appears in the passage of Genesis, I believe 30. Now, I didn't take the time, which would have taken quite a lot of time, to list all of the passages that these appear in. However, you can pretty easily just punch in these Strong's entries yourself into Blue Letter Bible or your concordance, Strong's Concordance of choice, or eSword, and see this for yourself. It occurs first, if I remember correctly, yes, in the passage where Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban, have this agreement about how Jacob will be paid. He's to be paid in this livestock that produces in a certain color variance. And this whole chapter concerning the types of colors of the livestock and what exactly he does to get them to breed in a certain way. The translations are really, really super clunky. What I believe is happening is that he is using the branch of a tree, or it is still possible that maybe it is a plant of some sort. But it would seem like a branch because of some of the words used, meaning like bark stripping. I'm not saying I'm 100% there. I'm just saying it's most likely. And what he does is he causes what he does to this branch or this piece of wood or whatever type of thing it is. He causes whatever is within it, sap, juice, excretion, to come out of it. And then he places it at the eating troughs of certain animals. And I keep saying certain animals because I don't want to necessarily call them sheep or goats or cows, because due to previous studies on animals, I find that a lot of them, the usage as far as how they're translated are a bit dubious, but it is livestock. So he puts them in front of particular types of livestock that he wants to breed more, so that when they breed, they will likely produce a livestock that are within the coloration that Laban agreed to give to him as his pay. He's not doing anything dishonest. He just knew that this particular tree, plant, etc., had aphrodisiac qualities in animals. The funny thing was, I looked that up, and there's a pretty large amount of trees and plants, and I would imagine many that we don't commonly even know of today, that have an aphrodisiac quality specifically in animals, and oftentimes specifically in certain types of animals. Bottom line, it certainly does look like it is a white type of wood. However, poplar, again, it's unproven. Another variation is H3840 Libna, again, same spelling, for pavement. And looking at it in context, the appearances of it in context seems to be very appropriate. The next one is H3842. This one's interesting. It's also Libna, same spelling, but it is translated as the moon, as in white. Now, I'm going to explain to you the reason why at the outset of this, I wasn't too sure about the Labans and their variations as being the equivalent of white, and why at this point, after I've spent so much time on this family, that I'm still not absolutely convinced of it being white. So let's see. H3842, Libna, often used as moon. I'm going to punch that in real quick to eSword and bring up the passages and explain to you a bit of what my issue is. So yes, it has 3 entries, all things told. The first one in Song of Songs, 6:10. The next 2 in Isaiah. It's only in Song of Songs that the like prefix ka is used. The reason, though, that it's translated as the moon and thus seen as white, since the moon actually is white, is because each time it appears sort of juxtaposed with the word hameh, which is, it's translated as sun about 5 or 6 times altogether. The thing about hameh and its root ham, which is just ha-em, even though ham does have the connotation of heat, certainly, I would say it's more root denotation, after doing a ham study months ago, would be more of a churning, in the sense of friction, which of course we know creates heat. It's not the only word that appears like that actually has more of a denotation of movement, in the case of ham, churning, with a connotation of heat. We're going to see that at least a few times. In fact, I believe that's actually what we see in the Har family as well. It's just not the churning sort of denotation. It's probably a lot more of just simply a fast, slight movement denotation with, again, a connotation of heat. Again, there's that friction. So, about 5 or 6 times hameh is translated as sun. I don't know about how fair that is, because it's also translated as heat very appropriately. Now, in the case of hameh, I could see why heat would be associated with sun, of course, And it does appear in passages with the word shamash, which is the predominant word for son. So, okay, you've got that connection too. And then when you see that Libna is used in juxtaposition with Hameh in the three passages it's used in, then that's sort of even more evidence for the possibility that it's actually an abstraction that's used for moon. It's not the word that's most commonly used for moon. There's a couple of different words. One that more specifically means moon, one that specifically means a month, or what they say is a new moon, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. In fact, a full moon would make a lot more sense than the new moon, and maybe at some point I'll be able to go over that. The thing about it is, I guess, if it's being juxtaposed against Hameh, and it's very easy to prove that Hameh has a connotation of heat, then I guess I would expect Lebna to be meaning cool as opposed to white. Now, it's only used in Song of Songs 6:10 with that ka prefix, and in the two appearances in Isaiah, it's actually used with the definite article, Libna. It's like saying the Libna. However, I mean, for a poetic passage, it doesn't have to be, that cool and that heat. If we're just talking about words that are connotating either moon or sun, I suppose if we use a broad rule, then if Libna does mean white or whitish, then it certainly could qualify as something connotating moon, whereas if Hameh does connotate heat, that it could be used as a euphemism for sun. So I'm going to just leave those alone and say, well, it is very likely that Libna is a euphemism for moon. Furthermore, we have entries such as H3843, Libna, again spelled the same as tile or brick, and H3844, Lebanon. Now, this is usually translated as Lebanon, and people get this idea that the modern-day country of Lebanon was named very specifically because of this. Lebanon is preceded by the definite article, again. And when you see that, it means that it's talking about a place that was named a specific thing, and it's usually being named that name because that name typifies or describes the area or what's in the area. And we'll discuss the Lebanon. The status quo definition is that it was named that because of the white mountain tops of what mountains there are in Lebanon. But if you read the Bible and you pay close attention to the passages with Lebanon in them, you'll see that Lebanon actually spans a number of quote-unquote countries. And when I say that, I'm speaking of Aram, Hamat, various possibly independent cities, as well as Tsur, translated Tyr, and Sidon, translated Sidon. So it encompasses a great deal of cities, countries, and area, far greater than the seaside, mostly seaside country, modern country of Lebanon. Also, H4404, Laban. You're going to see this a ton, wherein you'll have a root, whether it be biglyph or triglyph, And you'll also see it in the M section with simply an M before it with a very similar definition. In this case, the definition and usage of it is bricklin. However, I did take a quick look at the passages that it's in about 3. And I would say that even though it probably is something similar to the Laban root, I don't know that bricklin is necessarily the best word to be used for it. However, I will agree that it is related. There's also H2464, halebna. Now, this is defined as galbanum, but let's see, 2464, I believe that we are talking about something that appears one time. It does. It's Exodus 30:34, and it is galbanum. In other translations, I think they might call it some other kind of aromatic substance. Let's see. Galbanum. No, I guess it's mostly galbanum in most of them. If you look up galbanum, which I did, I will explain to you a little bit of what they say about it. Yes, so according to Wikipedia, galbanum is an aromatic gum resin and a product of certain umbelliferous Persian plant species in the genus Ferula. Isn't that convenient? Persian plant species. Interesting. Under resin, in polymer chemistry and material science, resin is a solid or highly viscous substance of plant or synthetic origin that is typically convertible into polymers. Resins are usually mixtures of organic compounds. This article focuses on naturally occurring resins. When you look at the pictures of this plant, galbanum, there's nothing white about it. Now, the reason that is even of interest is because the root of this word is Laban. Now, true, it starts out with the glyph ge, but it is essentially... Oh, I'm sorry. This one doesn't start with ge. It starts with... I'm thinking of the English translation, galbanum. No, I'm sorry. It starts with the glyph ha. The modern English equivalent is H, but then goes to Laban, and then ends with the feminine e. Haleben e. Okay. What I would surmise, just from a surface look at that, is that it is probably a substance from whatever it's from that is like a continual weeping. Something taken from a continual weeping, from whether it's plant, trees, or otherwise. But we can't really put it in the category of white. Now, can we? Not once we see what galbanum looks like, which it's mostly a green plant with yellow flowers. Another important root to all of this, and I think it needs to be mentioned, is H68 Aben. So it's spelled A-B-N, Aben. And it is translated, in my opinion, very appropriately as stone, whether it be large or small. Also related is H70 Aben. Same thing. Again, when you get these multiple different entries, you're typically going to see that one's a verb, one's a noun, one might be an adjective, so on and so forth. That's how they parse them out. You'll see why I think that's appropriate that they put that in with the next. I actually have a group within a group here. Just like lab, that simple biglyph root that I included at the start, there's also the latter possible biglyph root, ben, H1121. Ben being translated as son or age, child, group of descendants. So when you think about it, like if you see a passage where it says that, such and such was, say, 85 years old, the word that's actually going to be used there and then translated as years old is ben. When you do a very exhaustive word study on ben and all the variants of ben, here's what you're going to find out. Also related words, bene. Now it mostly appears as yeben, and it means to build or to have children. It's translated both ways, and in my opinion, very appropriately. Also, beniyeh, structures. Benim, which only appears twice, and it's translated as champion, kind of unproven. There's benin, structure. There's bene, there's that M prefix again, bene, structure or frame. There are a great many words with that ben root having something to do with build. And I'm here to tell you, everything indicates that that very word that is so oftentimes translated as son means that very same thing, build. Whether it be that a son from a man and woman is a building, one being built, growing, being taught, developing, and those same characteristics then being reflected in things that one would build and create in that way. I honestly think that that is the most likely explanation for why you find that ben root in so many words that have to do with building, being built, or structures in general. Now, all that being said, let me get to my summation of those two entries for Laban. Now, I ended up deeming this not as a pass or a fail, but as unproven. And that's due to the facts that even though a few entries, like for instance, H3842, Lebne, Moon, standing out along with all the white and leprosy verses in Leviticus, they're tough to understand in any other way. If they were a little bit easier to understand, or if there was, and it probably would have only been Libna as in moon, that I would have, if I would have been able to say, well, you know, there's a better reason, or there's a better alternative translation of this word than moon, then it might have actually just been a fail. However, there's just too many little snags to this, okay? The grammar and syntax of the majority of appearances, they don't concretely support white. It also appears likely that the two biglyph root possibilities of Laban being lub with n and la with ben have been blended together in the concordance entries. And what I'm saying is, even with the two roots that are used here, translated as white, I believe that, as I've told you, when you get a triglyph word, it is a word made of 3 characters or glyphs, its biglyph root could either be stressed on the first two glyphs or the last two glyphs. And you usually have to determine which that is. Now, the first, being the leb root with the N at the end, would seem to indicate a flowing from inside, or an excretion. Now, I'm going to show you what this means in the context of one of these Laban entries. So this is the H3836 entry. It's first found in the passages of Genesis with Jacob and the livestock and the breeding of the livestock. This is not the libneh, the material that he was using. This is translated as white, as in the stuff that seeped or oozed out of it. It occurs 2 times right there. You're going to see it again in Genesis 49:12 in a prophecy from Jacob concerning his descendants, in which he says, his eyes shall be red with wine, his teeth white with milk. That's kind of a poor translation, which I'm not going to go into at this time because I'm far more concerned with, it's also seen one more time in Exodus 16:31, describing the manna, the men that fell, that substance that they were using to bake cakes and make other foods out of. Describing it in English, it says, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers and honey. Another, I would say at least relatively questionable translation. Now, the reason why I want you to remember that this very word is used in those 2 passages of Genesis concerning what Jacob did to make that livestock, that particular colored or marked livestock breed, is because, let's see, it would be almost the rest of the entries given. And this is another reason why I said that I believe that the way that these roots are parsed out, as far as is it the leb root or is it the ben root, are mixed together, is because the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 entries are all to be found in Leviticus 13 concerning a type or types of skin diseases. After that, you have it appear in a clean proven instead of false or fail. Those 3 entries are describing horses. And these are horses that are described as white. Well, actually, it would be horses in 2, and 1 would be a chariot. So I'm leaving those alone because, again, those passages would require a very tedious translating of every single word in the passage, the grammar, the syntax, and so on and so forth, which I don't really have time to do within the context of what I'm doing here. Now, the funny thing about Leviticus 13 and the description of these skin diseases, I'm going to click on the appearance of Laban in Leviticus 13:3 so that I have them all up in front of me in Hebrew, and maybe I can point out the reason for such. In a lot of these passages, when this skin disease, and it is communicable, because if there are certain things observed by the priests, they are to quarantine the person with these afflictions for a certain amount of time to see if they change or what they do, so that they know whether or not they need to keep them quarantined away from other people. Now, the reason why I think that it's perhaps not appropriate to group this with other entries of the word Laban in which it's maybe more likely white, is because if you look at it in context, considering the words around it, more often than not, what you're going to see is a description of a skin problem or skin disease, that more often what the priests are looking for is something that is red. Now, when the word Laban is used in Leviticus, if you consider the fact that there is a lot of weight behind the idea that Laban oftentimes would be an excretion due to the lab root, meaning from within, and the glyph N being attached to it without an U before it. When you see UN as a suffix, like in the case of a Lebanun, that suffix is meaning that it is describing something that is very much like the root. So the root in that case is Laban, and you would put that un suffix on, un suffix, to say that this place in this example is very much typified by the root Laban. And I'm going to discuss that too. When looking at this in context and with the syntax, and when you consider communicable diseases, you put all of that together, and it is far more likely, especially based on the wording and the fact that usually they're looking for reddening of spots. The Laban would seem far more likely to be a secretion or an oozing. Now, even though it would seem that, some pus is white, a lot of it isn't. It's stained with blood or infections, and it's usually not white. So I don't think that should be so much a consideration as just a fact that if that area is oozing, weeping, excreting, etc., that is when you want to close this person up and keep them away from others. Now, let's see. Getting to... and I do want to point out before I get back to this, that's, again, I think an appropriate example of why these entries are mixed up concerning what the actual biglyph root of these words are. Now, I wrote, should this be taken to sometimes mean white? It's unknown at this time as far as the excretion, and that's what I just covered. The second form, which is the separate L with the biglyph of Ben, would seem to have more to do with building materials, ergo bricks. Aben H68 alludes to something similar. The examination of this family of roots requires what it requires. It's beyond the scope, again, of this exercise. And at this time, I see no definitive proof of white evident in any of the provable concrete entries. However, since I'm also unable to disregard the few inexplicable entries, mostly those of using it as a euphemism for the moon, and then those few entries in Zechariah, where it's specifically talking about a particular kind of horse and describes them as Lebanim, just the plural, im at the end of Laban. It'll remain as unproven either way. Now, something furthermore a bit interesting about this word and the idea of building materials and the idea that I've talked about in the past about what I call complete words. A word that can be a noun, it can be a verb, it can be a descriptive, depending on how it's used, because most of these things are as they do. And I want to give you an example of it. It's the first time we really even see Laban appearing. It's in Genesis 11:3. And these people say one to another, and here's the exact wording used, Na lebne lebanim. The na is a prefix indicating an action or verb to be done in the future tense, and lebanim having that suffix pluralizing the root. They're in essence literally saying to each other, let us make makers or build builders. And the fact that Laban is used as a brick being a common and strong building material, and we also see Aben as stone and used in a lot of passages to mean a common building material as well. I think that's a very fair conclusion to make concerning why we would see those types of doubled up roots used in ways like that. It should be expected that unlike today's idea of colors in the Bible, colors would be derived from a natural or frequent element or thing. White as snow is an easy concept to relay, i.e., very pure white. One reason to allow for the possibility of Laban and variations to mean or allude to white is the understanding that some of the strongest bricks, such as kiln bricks, are white bricks. And the great majority of natural glazing compounds are white and whitish. If the idea of Laban being white was derived from anything natural in the Bible, the understanding of the facts just stated point to the origin being in brick and tile. This would also suggest that more brick and tile used in the Bible was derived from low iron / heavy lime clays and or frequently fired with white-based glazes. Now, as a note concerning El Lebanon, this large wooded area that, of course, they mostly translate as Lebanon, and people get the idea that we're talking about the modern country on the Mediterranean today. Now, if the entry H3839 Lebna, in fact, a tree, it'd be expected to quite possibly be a tree typifying the area known as a Lebanon. Now, this is just as possible. Actually, I think it's far more likely than the excuse that we're given, that it was named that because of the snow-capped mountains. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. There's a lot of snow-capped mountains in the world, and I mean a lot. And I think the last thing that I would specifically think to characterize the modern-day country of Lebanon by is snow-capped mountains. Now, if this is not so, perhaps the idea of Laban to build, as it was the central location of the acquisition of timber materials by nations all around it, might have a lot to do with the reason that area was named El Lebanon. But if you consider the fact that it is highly likely that the entry Lebanais means a tree, and likely a whitish tree, then whatever that whitish tree is, like for instance a conifer, would likely describe that area, like a very, very large area of trees in which many large nations and city-states of peoples used this area to extract trees as building materials for, I would say, just about thousands of years. Well over 1,000 years. This would be an area so large and so dense with such a great propensity to grow trees of a certain kind, typically conifers such as fir, pine, etc., and in general just non-porous types of non-rotting woods like redwood and cedar, that to me, it would sound very, very, very much like an area in the United States we call the Pacific Northwest. Either which way, I think there's just far more evidence for a Lebanon, that area, to be named either after that light white wood, or the fact that Laban is oftentimes used in verb form, meaning build, make, structure, that sort of thing. So I want to conclude this whole thing by saying this. Even though we didn't see any of these words that were translated as white pass with flying colors for our modern equivalent of the color white, that's not to say that there aren't any words in the Bible that are specifically meaning white. I did also want to point out, before anybody sees it and freaks out, the entries for Psalm 51:7 and Isaiah 1:18, which seem to also, like that Arami entry I talked about, seem to be using a form of Laban in both occurrences to compare to snow and meaning white. I would tell you that, first off, the syntax, like in the case of Hor used in the Arami passage, the syntax doesn't concretely point to this supposed variance of Lebanon being a comparison or comparative to as snow. The syntax is unclear. And moreover, the thing about the occurrences in those two passages is that the root seems to be more bean or lebeen, and that is be-en, not just Laban or Laban or even Labun. The reason that's important is because if you check out bean, it has a few different entries. One of which is commonly translated as like understanding, perception, and probably having a lot to do with the fact, well, if you put it together with the L at the front, it could have a lot to do with I don't know if I can come up with a better word than a shrewdness, an understanding, a wisdom. When Joseph goes before Pharaoh and he tells him you should take a man who has an understanding, a shrewdness, a guy with a lot of common sense, the word he uses is bein, be-en. So again, those passages where you would think, well, that's just so obvious, so glaringly obvious, it is not. Now, what I was saying is, even though these words don't seem to pass or qualify as our modern understanding of white, know that there are other words in the Bible that would probably have been far more appropriate. But again, we're talking about a language, a culture, and a mindset that is different than this crummy fiat language we use today, which has become the lingua franca of the world, English, which is typically used and I believe created specifically for the act of deception. So we really got to do our best to get out of that mindset. Now, words that are used that oftentimes will appear with that ka prefix, denoting a simile, as or like, are words like H2461, halib, translated as milk. H6785, samar, translated as wool. Those two are really good. And then you have 7950, shalag, translated as snow. The Aramaic that I mentioned, 8517, talag, translated as snow. 8127, shin, translated as ivory. 7875, sheed, translated as lime or whitewash, which if you take a little time and look at that, you'll find out that it's quite possibly very close to or is gypsum, which is used in the plaster of Paris. There's also H2902, thuah, which is translated as plaster, and 8336, shash, translated as a fine linen, and sometimes as marble, but those two things are so similar. Who can tell them apart? Anyways, what I'm really hoping this did, this particular episode, concentrating on white, and as I do subsequent ones on more colors, it's not going to start out like I started this out. I took the first hour and was very meticulous about all of these entries, their numbers, so on and so forth. It's going to be a little bit more simpler, so we can get through it a little bit quicker, and there can be a little bit more commentary instead of just the mechanical readings off of these things. And, then if you want something that's more in-depth and mechanical, you can check the documents for those at the website. What I hope this illustrated is just the fact that we're gonna have to use a very different mindset when looking at these things, whether it be colors or whether it be a whole slew of concepts that we've got ingrained, programmed in our minds today that weren't necessarily concepts that were in the minds of the people existing during biblical times, nor certainly of the creator of the language itself. And if it was not within the mind of the creator of the language itself, I don't think it has any place whatsoever in our minds either. So at this point in time, I will just see you with the next episode, which for right now, all intents and purposes, I believe we're going to be moving on to another color. And as I said, the way that those shows will move will be a little bit more brisk and a little different than this, since we had to at least lay groundwork. So until then, I hope everybody is very well. Take care.